fundamental difference between randomness that supports strategy and randomness that undercuts strategy.
The host, Jeff Engelstein, makes a good point there. Output randomness is certainly more responsible for anger and resentment than input randomness. Output can take away control and break your plans, not out of strategic incompetence, but sheer bad luck. And most of the random stuff we like the least in games can be labelled as output randomness, such as random encounters and loot boxes. So certain developers are becoming privy to this. After FDL, which was stuffed to bursting with swingy output randomness, Subset made Into the Breach, which almost exclusively features input randomness, leading to a much fairer and more strategic game. And while early builds of Slay the Spire hid what the enemies were planning to do until after you finished your turn, the devs found the game was way more fun when they switched things around so the random choice happened at the start of your turn, allowing you to strategize around your foes. Output became input. But I don't think it's just a case of input randomness equals good, output randomness equals bad. They're both tools that must be used wisely, and poorly designed input randomness can wreck a game, just like carefully tuned output randomness can sometimes improve it. With input randomness, these unpredictable starting conditions can sometimes massively dictate the likelihood of success. So in Spelunky, these crates have random items in them. You're much more likely to get something mediocre like bombs or ropes than something amazing like a shotgun or jetpack. But if you are so lucky as to get one of these items at the start of the game, you're going to have a much easier time of things. This can make it hard to tell if your success was down to skill or just good luck, and it can also make runs where you don't get the goodies feel slightly pointless. Some speedrunners will just restart the game over and over again until luck is in their favour and they get good items in an early crate or shop. To be fair, this does lend Spelunky an interestingly spiky texture, but designers have found some clever new ways to present random starting conditions. In Slay the Spire, the devs didn't want you to just hit restart until you got some really powerful cards or a relic at the beginning of your run. So, they introduced a system where you start the game with additional bonuses, but only if you made it to the first boss on your previous go. This encourages players to at least try to play with the stuff they're given, and who knows, maybe they'll still find a strategy that can see them be victorious. Another way is to control the randomness in some fashion to reduce the chaos that it can bring. When setting up the tabletop game Pandemic, you start by removing all of the epidemic cards from the play deck. These cards are terrifying, game-changing events that can completely demolish your team. You then split the remaining cards into 4 piles and shuffle 1 epidemic card into each. Finally, you stack the 4 piles together to create a finished deck. It's a bit of a faff, but it's a clever way of ensuring that you always have a pretty fair game where epidemic events happen evenly throughout the adventure. It's impossible to have, say, 3 epidemics at the very start, or no epidemics until long after you've cured all the diseases. But there's still a chance of getting 2 epidemics in a row, or having an epidemic on the very first turn, though neither of these would break the game, and the odds are slim enough for those to be exciting, surprising, one-off events. I've never said the word epidemic so many times. And actually, lots of games put limits on their randomness. Diablo 3 has a smart loot system, where you're more likely to find items that match the character class you're playing, to reduce the likelihood of finding pointless hats and swords. And in modern versions of Tetris, the game doesn't just pick a block at random for every drop. Instead, the game generates a random sequence of all 7 blocks and then delivers them in that order before making a new sequence. This ensures that you'll always get a diverse selection of blocks, and there's an absolute maximum of 12 garbage blocks between 2 gorgeous eye blocks, sometimes called line pieces or Colin blocks worth. And for what it's worth, while Spelunky typically has a low chance of randomly giving you one of these icky dark levels, the game won't spawn one if you finished the previous stage in under 20 seconds, just to be merciful to speedrunners. Another thing to consider is how often are new input randomness events occurring. If these occur at the start of every single turn, it can have the effect of drawing the information horizon in claustrophobically close and stopping you from making plans that last any time at all. Designers should ideally consider their game's information flow, a term invented by Ethan Hoekner in the article Plan Disruption. He points to XCOM, where we can make strategic plans about how we want to approach each mission, and for a good few turns, our plan will be pretty viable. Not perfect, thanks to all the alpha randomness, but close enough. But every now and again, you'll stumble onto a new pod of enemies, or a fresh batch of foes will descend onto the battlefield. This unexpected spike in new information disrupts your plan and forces you to stop, regroup, and rethink. He says a good pattern to follow is the spiky information flow, in which high-impact information is collected into discrete spikes that happen at regular intervals, with a slow, regular flow of information between the spikes. As for output randomness, you might wonder why developers would want to use it at all. Well, for starters, this sort of randomness can be a good way of simulating mistakes and inaccuracies in a game with an abstract combat system, which is games where you tell characters to perform an action rather than doing the action yourself. If your units never missed, then that wouldn't be particularly realistic. Also, output randomness forces players to think about risk management and to create contingency plans if things go wrong, which I think are totally valid skills to test. There's this idea that output randomness essentially becomes input randomness for the next turn, because you'll be dealing with the consequences of whatever just happened. Essentially, the best XCOM players are those who have a backup plan if their shots miss. And there are also methods to make output randomness feel more fun. One way is to get away from binary hit or miss mechanics. In Phoenix Point, which comes from original XCOM designer Julian Gollop, each bullet fired is simulated through a ballistic system, so you might find that some of your bullets hit and some of them miss, which is way less annoying than XCOM's punitive completeness. It can also be important to show the player the odds, because this allows them to make way more informed decisions about which risks they're willing to take, or how their actions, like moving closer to the enemy, can impact their chances of success. Unfortunately though, humans are just really bad at understanding odds. That's thanks to countless cognitive biases in our pattern-seeking brains that make it really hard to deal with random numbers. In fact, game developers frequently lie about the actual chances of things happening, so the probability in games better matches the broken probability in our heads. The numbers in most Fire Emblem games are subtly massaged in the player's favour, so, for example, a 90% chance to hit is actually more like a 99% chance. If you lose two 33% chance battles in Civilization, the third will always succeed because that's how we think numbers work. And there's allegedly a pity timer in Hearthstone to ensure you'll always get a legendary card after a certain number of empty packs. If number manipulation isn't your thing, one of the best ways to get around this is to ditch those cold, unknowable computer calculations in favour of recognisable, real-world mechanisms like the six-sided die. Zach Gage, creator of the dice-filled space survival game Farsis, says, "We understand things that we can hold in our hand. When things get abstract, especially with math, it becomes very difficult. Human beings just have this innate understanding of stuff that we can touch and hold and turn and look at. The dice in Farsis are an analogue to something everyone is familiar with." Farsis and the similarly tabletop-inspired Armello even include physics systems to drive their digital dice in an effort to make them seem even more realistic. Other games use cards, another familiar, real-world favourite. Cards are interesting because where dice feature independent probability, i.e. each throw of the die has zero impact on the next one, cards can have dependent probability, i.e. by drawing a card and removing it from the deck, you've now changed the makeup of the deck and impacted the probability of the next draw. It's the latter that makes it possible to rack up ridiculously fun synergies in Slay the Spire. It can also be good to have output randomness in places that will only ever be in the player's favour. The only real example of output randomness in Into the Breach is the game's building defence system, where there's a very small chance that the enemy's attack will actually miss and save you from surefire defeat. It's so small that you never actually count on it to save you, but boy does it feel good when it lands. Here's the game's co-designer, Justin Marr.
We found that if there's randomness where you're expecting something bad and then you get something good, no one ever complains. So that's the only type of randomness, output randomness that we roughly need.
So randomness can be an incredibly important part of games. It's used for variety, balance, rewards, the information horizon, and probably more things I've forgotten about. But because it can impact everything from fairness to player psychology, it's something that designers must use with great care and attention. Understanding the difference between input and output randomness is perhaps the most important thing to learn, but it's also crucial to realise that neither of these is a silver bullet or a dastardly trap. Both can endanger or improve a game's design depending on how they are used. But when used correctly, randomness can do amazing things. It can create surprises and unique situations. It can force the constant re-evaluation of strategies, and it can turn players into risk-calculating tacticians. Thanks so much for watching. I've put some links in the description to some resources if you want to learn more about the technical side of random number generation, and also to head off the comments about how computers can't do true randomness. I also want to give a huge thank you to my patrons, especially those who helped contribute towards this video in my new GMTK workshop. It's a thing for $5 backers, where they get to see early versions of certain new videos and provide feedback or suggestions. Their help was invaluable on this episode. Hi, I'm Mark Brown, this is Game Maker's Toolkit, and this is not Dark Souls. It's actually a game called Lords of the Fallen, but you'd be forgiven for thinking that it's one of the Souls games. It looks like Dark Souls, feels like Dark Souls, and borrows most of its ideas from Dark Souls, like stamina management, dropping your experience points when you die, and rolling. Lots and lots of rolling. In fact, we've seen a whole bunch of games recently that are, to put it charitably, inspired by the Souls series. The Surge, by the same developer as Lords of the Fallen, is Dark Souls done sci-fi. Neo is Bloodborne, with a samurai twist. Sultan Sanctuary is a Souls game in 2D, and so is the upcoming Death's Gambit. They all have their own ideas, like stance-based combat and special finishing moves, but they also stick rigidly to the Dark Souls formula, with renamed versions of Estus flasks, bonfires, souls, and even something as specific as the Homeward Bone. Some might call these games clones. Others, including Patrick Klepek over at Waypoint, have argued that these games should be part of an entirely new genre. Call them Souls-likes, or Soulsborne games, or something along those lines. And, okay, let's investigate that idea by asking what happens when we turn a game into a genre. First, we need to understand how new genres get made. So, check it. Here's a super quick 4-step guide to making a new genre. Step 1. Someone makes a game that is both innovative and wildly successful. Step 2. It gets cloned. We give these games a nickname. They copy pretty much everything about that successful game, just with a different theme and some minor tweaks.
I'm Duke Nukem.
Step 3. The clones keep coming, but they start to make radical changes to the formula, adding new stuff and tossing out most of the features from the original game. By this point, the clones don't really feel like clones at all. Step 4. With just a couple immutable factors linking all of these games, we realise that it's not just a bunch of clones, but an entire genre. So we change the name. So I wonder what would happen then if a genre never went past step 2. Like if games kept closely following one specific game, and we were still naming the genre after that landmark game years and years later. What would that be like? Oh. Yeah, it's easy to forget that roguelikes are called roguelikes because the games are literally like Rogue, which was a randomly generated dungeon crawler from 1980. That game was super popular, and like Doom, led to a bunch of similar games, such as NetHack, Moira, and Angband, which all made small tweaks and additions. Similar games are literally... Yeah, it's easy to forget that roguelikes are called roguelikes because the games are literally like Rogue, which was a randomly generated dungeon crawler from 1980. That game was super popular, and like Doom, led to a bunch of similar games, such as NetHack, Moira, and Angband, which all made small tweaks and additions to the formula. But for the longest time, roguelikes never really went beyond that. In fact, in 2008, a bunch of developers got together to define the Berlin interpretation of roguelikes, and listed a whopping 14 high and low value factors that could be used to define a roguelike. It lists everything from permadeath and turn-based gameplay to ASCII graphics, complexity, and numbers. So where first-person shooters can allow for military games, abstract puzzle shooters, open-world RPGs, underwater dystopias, and more, most classic roguelike games felt very similar, with minor tweaks to an established formula. More like sequels than entirely new games. Thankfully, roguelikes got a whole lot more interesting when developers stopped caring about ticking those boxes and started mashing up Rogue's best ideas with other types of game. One of the first was Spelunky, and in his book about the game, creator Derek Yu says he liked playing games like NetHack for the variety that how meaningful death is in them, and so picked those elements, but not the turn-based gameplay, grids, or ASCII art. Instead, he took those systems and paired them with another the platform. Rogue's random levels solved Yu's platformer bugbear of needing to memorize level layouts, and expressive platformer gameplay helped bring Rogue's ideas to an entirely new audience. Reducing roguelikes from a whole bunch of factors to just permadeath and procedural generation has given the genre an entirely new lease on life, and opened it up to a new generation of both players and developers. These games don't exactly play like Rogue, but I think they capture the same feelings of surprise and peril. And you see, when we reduce a game down to its constituent elements, devs can copy them and end up with pretty much the same game as the original developer. But if we consider why those features were designed the way they were, and what sort of experience they led to, devs can find different ways to give players that same feeling. Go look at the many games that are inspired by The Legend of Zelda, for example. There's no Zelda-like genre, and I think because there's no easy template to follow, each game ends up very different. Every developer gets to make their own interpretation of what makes a Zelda game special, and use that to influence their own creations. These games all work very differently, but they capture the spirit of the Zelda series, or at least how that developer sees the Zelda series. Anyway, die-hard fans of classic roguelikes haven't been too happy about their genre being expanded to incorporate platformers and shooters, and they have some creative names for these new games. And I have some sympathy for them. As players, we use genres to find new games that are similar to the ones we love, and if you liked playing roguelikes for their turn-based, grid-based gameplay, you won't be too impressed by the twitchy arcade thrills of Downwell. If you ask me, the best way to handle it is to just put roguelike on the front of other genres. Easy. But then again, maybe naming a genre after a specific game is not the best idea in the world, because it can effectively canonize that game as some holy text to be forever referred to. In his Medium post, Picture in a Frame, which is partly about this type of genre, Amar Al-Azhar says, often the quality of a game in the genre is judged by its adherence to or ability to emulate aspects of the entries considered to be the series landmarks. Metroidvania, which was once a catty nickname for Castlevania games that played like Metroid, but is now an entire genre of games that play like Metroid, has effectively mythologized Super Metroid as the perfect exploratory game. And so, while the genre should be about any game that has you exploring an interconnected world, most developers just copy Nintendo's approach and use very similar locks, abilities, progression, secrets, and world design. Thankfully, some games do take a different approach, like Toki-Tori 2, which has a similar world structure to Metroid, but has no items, abilities, or even combat. Instead, it's a puzzle game, and you open new areas by gathering knowledge of the game's mechanics, not through upgrades. But it's telling that Two Tribes said it didn't set out to make a Metroidvania. It just stumbled into it when it made a world with alternative paths, a world map that marks where you've been, and a story that encourages backtracking and revisiting of previous areas. Holding up one game as the blueprint can also push aside other games that are doing similar work. Before Metroidvania became a thing, there were other games with interconnected worlds that could equally serve as inspiration. And I think a similar thing has happened with immersive sims. because while it's not name-checked in the name of the genre, it feels like Deus Ex has become the de facto formula. And so we end up with a bunch of first-person shooters where you have magic or bionic powers and can play as a stealthy ninja or a mass murderer. Up to you.
Lethal it is. But remember, they do have hostages.
But this pushes aside games like Thief. For that game, the Looking Glass design philosophy, which would one day be rebranded as Immersive Sim, was about embodying a character in a realistic world and being able to tackle problems in ways that made sense for that character. Garrett is a thief, and so solves problems largely through stealth and burglary, while direct attacks are discouraged. Oh, and he doesn't have superpowers either. Thief is worthy of study and influence, but the genre almost treats it like a failed experiment on the path to the perfect immersive sim. The same thing often happens to Demon Souls, which gets routinely ignored as just some flawed prototype that led to Dark Souls 1. I've never played it, but watch this video by Matthew Matosis to hear more about what demons can teach us. The other effect of this mythologizing is that the genres don't easily allow for games that go beyond these landmark titles. In the early days of the Looking Glass design philosophy, we saw it evolve and mutate, but once it became codified as more of a named genre with a set of expected mechanics, in some ways it feels like the evolution of the idea has stalled. I certainly felt this way when playing through Prey. As much as I enjoyed the game, I also felt like I'd played the same thing many times before, right down to the audio diaries, upgrade trees, hacking minigames, and stealth pathways. It's perhaps best to take Immersive Sim as less of a formula and more of a general ethos, as a way of thinking about systemic gameplay and player agency and world reactivity. That can then be applied to everything from Hitman to The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild to immersive games we haven't even thought of yet. Because a genre like this can make us satisfied with what already exists, when we should be pushing against the boundaries and asking, what's next? Don't get me wrong, it's absolutely fine to take influence from a specific game. The truth is, every game is built on the titles that came before it. But when we turn a game into a genre, that game can become a formula that all developers end up following in pretty much the same way. We judge new games by their ability to emulate the original. We erase the contributions of other important games that were exploring the same territory, and because we keep coming back to the same game over and over again, the pace of innovation can grind to a halt. It's the difference between someone saying, hey, I'm going to use Metroid as a base and build something new, and a cottage industry of developers all doing the same thing for years and years and years. So while genres can be very useful, I mean, they help players find stuff that is similar to the games they like, and they give developers more structure than a completely blank page, I'd argue that we want them to be as broad as possible and not narrowly defined by many of the mechanics of a single landmark game. Which brings us back to Dark Souls. Look, if we are going to make a Souls-like genre, let's try not to make it quite so restrictive, yeah? Let's fast forward the whole roguelike thing and try and make the genre about just one or two elements. I personally recommend the game's deliberate combat that comes from action warm-ups, animation priority, and stamina management. I think that could lend itself to a whole bunch of interesting games. We've already seen it in Grasshopper's Let It Die, which is a free-to-play game with a roguelike structure, and Dead Cells, which is a roguevania. God, that's a whole nother thing. Don't get me started on that. Anyway, also maybe don't call the genre Souls-like. That's only going to hamper its growth, as every game will be compared to Dark Souls 1, and we will run the risk of it taking years before we get games that radically depart from Dark Souls. But a genre isn't the only way to pay homage. If you love Dark Souls and want to take influence from the game, there are perhaps better ways to do it than just reducing the game down to an ingredients list and then copying that. Instead, find new ways to capture the spirit of Dark Souls, and like with Zelda, the spirit will mean different things to different people, leading to a wider variety of games than if we define a specific formula. Some might admire the punishing nature of the Souls games, or that feeling of surprise and relief when you open up a shortcut, or the joy of untangling a complex backstory told through item descriptions and statues. For me, the soul of Dark Souls was that it was unknowable and obtuse. People talk in riddles, mysterious voices help you spot ambushes, and traps lay behind every corner. Ironically, none of the Souls-like games can capture that feeling because, at this point, they're completely familiar. but games like Highlight Drifter can. So I guess my point is, take influence and inspiration from your favourite games, but be wary about turning those games into genres. That can stifle innovation and stop developers from coming up with the next game that's as important and influential as Dark Souls. Hey, thanks for watching. GMTK is made possible thanks to the generous backing of my patrons. The names on screen are my top tier supporters. Because I hit 2,000 backers, everyone now pays per month instead of per video, which effectively halves your contribution. Backers get access to a Discord, a book club style game club, early access to videos, developer Q&A sessions, and more. Doing this video has given me so much more to talk about than could ever fit into a single episode. I mean, we can find examples of genres leading to very similar experiences outside of these hyper-specific ones. There are genres that are more about capturing a feeling than copying a bunch of mechanics, and so there'll be plenty more on this subject down the line. I do need to stop promising future topics at the end of videos and then never making them. I'm a bad person, I'm sorry. Imagine a version of Bioshock without cutscenes, without Andrew Ryan's bathysphere PowerPoint, without Atlas yapping in your ear, and without those juicy audio diaries. Do you think players would still understand what the game was all about? Well, I think they actually have a pretty good idea, because all you have to do is look at your surroundings. The game is set in a massive city at the very bottom of the ocean. One clearly made for those in high society, considering the fancy bars, apartment complexes, and theatre districts. And it's a place built on lofty philosophical ideals. But it's also a place of ruin and despair. There was obviously a moment of downfall. Some people split into violent factions and others just lost their minds. And this all went down on New Year's Day, 1959. Bioshock is a wonderful example of how a game's environment can be an effective method of storytelling, and how embedding narrative elements into the very spaces and places that we visit throughout the game can speak just as loudly as more traditional forms of storytelling. And that is exactly what this episode of Game Maker's Toolkit is all about. In this video, I'm going to focus on 3 ways that the environment can be used for storytelling, and talk about how level design can drive our understanding, feeling, and identity. Starting with understanding. So, the signs, stiffs, and scribbles in Bioshock are examples of environmental storytelling. The use of set dressing to create small, optional, and self-contained vignettes, like warnings written in blood, or the many skeletons in the Fallout games who have been deliberately posed by the game's designers to suggest humorous or melancholy ways that people have died. The term was first coined, as far as I can tell, by former Disneyland designer Don Carson, who wrote an influential article in 2000 about what game developers can learn from theme parks. The term was then made even more popular in a GDC talk by Harvey Smith and Matthias Walsh, where they described the technique as staging player space with environmental properties that can be interpreted as a meaningful whole, furthering the narrative of the game. The cool thing about environmental storytelling is that it requires a certain level of deductive reasoning, as we connect up details to create an overall story. We use investigative and archaeological skills to determine relationships, cause and effect, and history. This makes us an active participant in the storytelling process, and not just a passive viewer. Plus, if you just want to focus on the shooty stuff, you can do that without the story getting in your way. For the most part, environmental storytelling is about static objects, but it can also stretch to things like overheard conversations, animations happening in the level, and of course, text, in things like books, item descriptions, scans, notes, and emails. And while it is generally used to describe what happened before you even got to a space, It can also be used as a way of highlighting how your actions have impacted the environment in the time since you visited. So if you kill a shopkeeper in Deus Ex Mankind Divided, later in the game the shop will be a police crime scene and then permanently closed to the public. It's also worth noting that environmental storytelling isn't just for narrative, but can have gameplay uses too. A saw blade stuck in a sliced up zombie suggests using these saws with your gravity gun to defeat enemies. An enemy fried on a fence warns us about the dangers of touching it. Maps and signage can help us navigate complex spaces, and props can suggest puzzle hints in a non-intrusive way. But here's the thing. Environmental storytelling, if we're using the term specifically to mean those micro-narrative vignettes, is just one part of a much larger structure of using the environment to suggest narrative. It's the high-level stuff. Below that, then, is the individual places in a game. You know, a farmer's market, a bar, a medical pavilion, and a theatre district. And beyond that, the individual rooms in those zones. That's the medium level, which might be most accurately called, well, level design. And this can also be used for narrative because things like architecture, layout, materials, and scale can tell us a lot about the people who use those spaces. For example, in Dishonored 2's Dust District, the level designers at Arcane use verticality to show how the working class are literally underneath the people in power. And the sheer opulence of Talos 1 and Prey tells us a very different story about its use compared to the more utilitarian Sevastopol in Alien Isolation.
Украинский. Такой читатель. Губаев. Пузер. Ой,